The research we undertook with the NSPCC and the University of Bristol, that involved a survey of 1,500 young people, and we found very worrying rates of intimate violence in those young people's relationships, and that was physical, sexual and emotional. For example, we found that a third of girls experienced some form of sexual violence and a quarter some form of physical violence. So when we look at the research, what we found was that though the levels of violence were worrying for both boys and girls, the impact was significantly different. So girls reported that the violence made them feel scared, they were worried, they felt intimidated, whereas boys most often reported that either it annoyed them or it had no effect. But we didn't find that the boys were saying that they were very scared or frightened about it. I think one of the main ways in which violence in young people's relationships is different to adult relationships is the way young people actually live their lives. And we know that for young people, new technologies are really central. That's an aspect that they have with all their peers, how they communicate, and that can now be used against them. So, for example, in the interviews we did with particularly young women, we found that the new technologies have been used to keep surveillance of them. They had to tell their partners where they were, what they were doing. Partners looked at Facebook to see if they'd been to parties they weren't supposed to go to, and I think that's really difficult when you have that 24-hour surveillance, and that's something that actually wasn't available 40 years ago. I think another difference between adult experiences and young people's experiences of intimate violence is to do with sexual reputations. For young women, it's very important to ensure their sexual reputation remains unblighted. And what we know is that partners can often use the behaviour within relationships against them to taint those relationships. So, for example, they will say that if you don't stay in the relationship, what they'll do is tell their friends that they've had sexual intercourse with them, and that can be hugely problematic for young women. And we found from our research that another difference was in relation to the social norms in young people's cultures. And many of the young women we spoke to were saying that when they told their friends about the violence, often their friends would say, well, that's normal, that's what you expect in relationships. And therefore it reinforces the fact that it's seen as a normal, though unwanted, but still a normal aspect of being in an intimate relationship. And I think that probably adult women wouldn't have that same response from their friends. From the research we did with disadvantaged young people, we did find that certain groups of young women were more at risk of violence. Those are the young women who are in social care, residential or foster care. We found that teenage mums had very high levels of violence in their relationships. And also young people who use violence in other areas of their lives were also more likely to experience violence in relationships, but also, and very importantly, also more likely to use violence in relationships. Another group that were really vulnerable were young people who had a same-sex partner. Now, we only had a small number of respondents in the survey, 50 young people, but they had much higher levels of violence in their relationships than young people who had an opposite-sex partner, and that was for boys and girls. And this is also reflected in American research. From our research, what we found was that young women wanted particular things to help them talk about their experience of violence, and that was to have advice which was at that point of discussion confidential, so they had time to form a relationship with the person, talk about their experiences, and then work out with that professional what they wanted to do. Interestingly, in the research, what we found was that the young women who'd spoken to learning mentors in schools were particularly positive about their responses. I think that was because they weren't seen as being in any other aspect of their lives having control over those young people. They weren't teachers, they weren't social workers, they were there simply in relation to their education, and therefore it provided them with a space that wasn't stigmatised in any way. In the research we undertook, some of the young women hadn't spoken to anyone else about the violence they were experiencing. And when we asked them why that was, why they hadn't been able to talk to anyone, they said that they were worried that maybe their experiences wouldn't be taken seriously, they wouldn't be believed, or maybe some said that they're also worried that they would be told to leave that relationship, when actually what they wanted was the violence to stop, but they didn't want to leave their partners. Many of the young women we spoke to were extremely worried that if they talked about the violence they're experiencing to someone, a teacher or maybe a social worker, that information would then be passed on to other professionals and other agencies. And they didn't like the idea of people telling what happened to them to other people without them having control over that process.